So in today's video, we're covering carburation versus fuel injection. Now, that topic by itself is a very, very simple, very short topic. But what we're going to cover in this video is where carburation is good, where fuel injection is good, the different levels of fuel injection, because that's not just saying fuel injection, that's a blanket statement. We need to break this down so you understand what questions you're actually answering, and I didn't understand that. Back probably even 5 years ago, I didn't understand the right question to ask to understand fully why fuel injection can make more power than carburation. I had ideas, but I didn't fully understand. And that's what we're going to be covering in today's video. To the Jumbotron of knowledge! Carburation versus fuel injection. What's going on here? Alright, so where is a carburetor better? It's a simple mechanical design. No electronics. It's super lightweight. If you're building like an end-of-the-world vehicle, right, like something EMP-proof, it's going to have to be carbureted. You need everything mechanical. And that's where carburation really excels because it's so simple. With just a vacuum gauge and a screwdriver, you can pretty much fix your carburetor, tune your carburetor. They're cheap. Like the best carburetors, I think, well, I haven't shot for a carburetor in a long time, but the best carburetors were between like $500 and $800. Like that's premium top-of-the-line carbs. Maybe they're a little bit more expensive now. I don't know. I haven't shot for a carb in a few years. But it's cheap. It's reliable. The knowledge is proven. We've used them for a long time. You don't have to reinvent the wheel here. You're not trying to figure anything out. It's been done over and over and over again. You could call up Summit Racing, tell them your exact setup, and they're like, you need this carburetor right here. This is the exact carburetor you need. Again, lightweight, no electronics, no ECU, very simple. It's got that raw horsepower feel, just the raw like hot rod, or they look cool too. I love the way the intakes look. They still get used a lot in drag racing, circle track, because it keeps the overall cost down. When you get into fuel injection, it gets expensive quick. So these are your basic carburetor setups. You have dual accelerator pump carbs, dual metering blocks, then you have a single metering block, accelerator pump, two barrel, your quadrijunks, your Eldebrock. Again, this isn't something new. These have been decided out. All this stuff is worked out and worked perfectly for different engine applications. You can find a carburetor for your setup. And like I said, look at these things. They look freaking awesome. All right, so why did the world move past carburetors? Well, first off, you got the Venturis. They put a restriction on the engine. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Second, you can get bog and lean spikes in the beginning of your fuel. Yes, an accelerator pump puts a Band-Aid on it, but it's a very crude Band-Aid. You're just dumping a bunch of gas in there trying to compensate for the mass amount of air if you drop on the throttle right from the start. You can get pretty close to where you have great crisp throttle response, but it's not perfect. You're going to run lean. You're going to stumble a little bit sometimes, especially at low RPMs, especially with really big carburetors. They're temperature and altitude and weather sensitive. They don't equally distribute the air-fuel mixture from cylinder to cylinder. Depending on what cylinder it is, it can run a little bit leaner than other cylinders. It's not evenly distributed. Cold starts can be a little bit rough. Big idles, or a bad idle, especially with big cams. That's another thing that fuel injection really masters is the big cam. Vacuum dependency. So if you're working with something like forced induction, well, vacuum can be an issue. So this is the big question that I didn't know to ask to understand why fuel injection by itself is just, ultimately it can unlock more power than you can with a carburation. That's because of how a carburetor works. It has to put a restriction on the airflow to create a vacuum to suck fuel and meter the fuel. Again, look at all these designs. It creates a restriction. Creates a restriction. Creates a restriction. You don't have to do that with fuel injection. There is no restriction. So, all right, in this hypothetical scenario, we're going to pretend this is a magic wand. I'm going to wave this magic wand and the intake and everything disappears. Somehow, though, the fuel injectors are still magically over the intake valve, right? So all that stuff disappeared. Yeah, the engine is going to run at what essentially would be wide open throttle, but it's going to run at max capacity. And it will run with fuel injection because these magic fuel injectors are still going to somehow spray inside there. what we're doing with this magic scenario is we're just removing the air restriction. So heads, fuel injectors are right there. It still runs. It's going to be like, whoa! But the point is, it's still going to run. It's still going to feed in the amount of fuel. You don't need any restrictions, so you can potentially unlock more power from your engine because you don't have to choke it. You absolutely have to choke it with a carburetor. Otherwise, everybody would run 2,000 CFM carburetors. This way, there's no restriction on the engine. But when you remove that restriction, and the air can go there, and then there's no vacuum, it's not sucking fuel anymore. It has to create a vacuum to be able to pull the air and meter the fuel. Again, this also runs into a problem when you get into forced induction. Like this actually is a vacuum secondary right here. This is the problem I ran into with this exact type of blower. I put on a vacuum secondary carburetor. I'm not going to go into too much detail how a carburetor works because this slide is just, the point is to make where carburetors have problems. Anyways, vacuum secondary. How a vacuum secondary works is your primary is open, your vacuum in your intake drops to zero. There's no more well, there's vacuum, but very little vacuum. But as the vacuum starts building, it slowly sucks open your secondaries. You throw a vacuum secondary carburetor on a blower, the second you drop the hammer, those secondaries pop open because they think their engine's at top speed and it needs air. So it takes a process that's supposed to happen slowly as your engine builds RPMs, and it drops it immediately. Boom! Your engine goes into a super lean condition, and like me, I burnt off spark plugs. I couldn't figure out why the electrodes were burning off, and then next thing you know, I burnt a hole, like literally a hole from cylinder to cylinder through my head. That's how hot the chambers got. Not cool at all. Now you got blow-through. Carburetors measure and meter the air with velocity, not density. So if you increase the density of air going through the carburetor, it has a really hard time metering the air because it adds in the fuel by how much air flows past it. By, again, velocity. So when you put more air in a smaller space and you push it through there, it has problems. So you have to get special carburetors for both these situations. So again, just by switching to EFI, regardless what it is, you can potentially unlock more power because now you don't need a restriction on airflow. You can run maximum airflow. You can just feed in the amount of fuel that's needed. All right, so let's get into the first throttle. That is your TBI, throttle body injector. This is basically an electronic carburetor. So what you're going to do with this is you're going to change two things. One, you're going to remove the restriction of air on the engine. Yes, I mean, you still have to get a properly sized is the wrong word. You still have to get a throttle body with enough flow through to not have a restriction, but you're removing the restriction or the need for the restriction. Again, potential power, not actual power. You're removing the need for restriction and you're removing the need for vacuum. Now it no longer runs off of vacuum. It's going to use sensors. These are very basic sensors. This is the easiest way to swap from a carburetor to electronic fuel injection by going with a throttle body because it's basically an electronic carburetor. You're going to need a couple of sensors, not very many, and an ECU, so like your air-fuel ratio sensor and stuff like that you're going to need. But other than that, like, again, it's basically just an electronic carburetor. So you have dual fuel injector and single fuel injector. Again, no longer replaces, you no longer need vacuum, and you no longer need to have a restriction on the engine. You can run at maximum airflow. Now you do need, all right, so like if you had like this really, really big throttle body, right, it would struggle at low speeds because you wouldn't be able to find the perfect space where it could get open. The LS3 ran into that problem, so they ultimately had to put a electronic opener on that. So that's why you'd run like twin 4-barrel throttle bodies or something like that, so you can have low speed, good low speed throttle response. It's not throttle response, going from like idle to just a little bit of throttle. If you don't break it up into like 2 4-barrels or something like that, you're going to have problems with that because it's going to want to dump a bunch more air than you're ready for. So, again, you have to still not properly size it, but you have to have enough of a big enough opening to remove that restriction to unlock all the potential power. You're also going to lose the cold weather starts. You're not going to have problems with those anymore. You're going to have nice, strong throttle response. Manual throttle bodies. Again, they went to electronic later. We'll talk about all that stuff a little bit later. Just better fuel delivery, better consistency, easier transition, and it's an easier transition to go from a carburetor to this setup because there's not a whole lot of electronics involved in that. Again, it's basically an electronic carburetor. Here's a couple examples of them. This is your standard 4-barrel throttle body. As you see, there's no restrictions there. It's just open air. And then you got your fuel injectors that go right in there. This one's for a blower. This is your standard like GM throttle body with your 2 injectors right there on top. This one's actually designed to look like a carburetor because, again, essentially they are just an electronic carburetor. This is a blow-through one. Now, again, because you don't need vacuum, they work ideal for boost. Good to go there. All right, so now we get into the two multi-port fuel injection, the MPFI. So what this is going to do is give you 1 injector per cylinder. So you're going to give it a dry intake. So now you don't have to worry about, all right, so looking at my intake, I don't have to worry about fluid also going through there. All I have to worry about is air going through there. So I'm going to design this to flow the most amount of air because the fuel is going to drop right on top of the valve. So this is great for super high RPM breathing. Again, I already talked about the dry manifold. 1 injector per cylinder. That was a huge step up, just taking the fuel out of the intake and dropping it directly on the cylinder. Big leap forward in power and tuning. This is essentially what you're going from. So this is the twin port. You're going to dump the fuel up front, and it's going to go through the intake. You're going to have a wet intake. You can get puddling in the intake. This is not ideal. It works better than a throttle, or works better than a carburetor, but not ideal. So now you're going to put an injector on top of each cylinder, so all the intake has to worry about is airflow. Now there is different types of multi-port fuel injection. MPFI, we're going to kind of brush over them lightly, but so what it's going to go on here is you got, again, this is your consistent injector. So, all right, we've hit the evolution where we got 1 injector on top of cylinder. Now we're just going to break down how they work because how they fire is the next advancement in fuel injection. So you have constant fuel injection. The fuel injector is just going to spray constantly. And they're going to use fuel pressure to control how much fuel is going in there, but still it's going to use computers and that to monitor it. Then you got bank and batch firing. So what that'll happen is like maybe every other cylinder or something like that. It'll fire every 1 revolution of the engine. So yes, sometimes when the injector fires, it's going to be on a closed valve, so you're going to have fuel that pools on top of the valve. But other times when it fires, the valve's going to be open. So they'll either do like 1 bank, other bank, 1 bank, other bank, or they might do like cylinder 1, 2, and just stagger it. Either way, like it's not, they're not really, it's hard to explain. So you're using the crankshaft positioning to determine when it's going to fire instead of the camshaft, which is what we use now, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. So once the crankshaft rotates like 180 degrees, it's going to fire the injector once, depending on if it's a bank or a batch. So it's still just a random, they're just firing, and it's measuring the air-fuel ratio, and it's increasing the fuel because of that, but it's not the precision we get today. And that is sequential. That's where you have each injector is on top of the valve, and it only fires when the valve is open, and it stops firing before the valve is closed, which opens up big cams, because now you don't have to worry about a cam with a whole bunch of overlap and just blowing the air fuel right out the exhaust, stuff like that. It's going to be way more efficient. It's what we use today. But again, you're going to need a whole lot more of your sensors, like, for example, a camshaft positioning sensor. Now that comes into play. You're going to need a more advanced ECU, a modern ECU of today. Back then when we didn't have that kind of computing power, it was a little bit hard for engines to do that. That's why I just did like bank or batch. So, sequential injectors. Each injector fires with the timing of the valve. It requires a camshaft positioning sensor. You're going to get smoother idles. It's going to work a lot better at part throttle. Improved fuel economy. Good to go there. Massive power boost. Now it's going to be able to get a lot more power because now you're controlling how much is going in each individual cylinder. It's not just some random where fuel's sitting on top of a closed valve waiting for the valve to open, which is not ideal. So essentially, like I was explaining, the injector's right here. It's going to fire only when the valve is open. So if the valve's closed, it's not going to fire. If the valve's open, it's firing. All right, now we get into what the best way to think about this is what a diesel does, but it's in a gas engine. So what's going to happen here is you have the injector inside of the cylinder. And when the cylinder, right before the spark hits, boom, it throws in the gas right then. That allows you to run higher compression. The fuel going in is going to cool the charge down, so now you can run shittier fuel on higher compression. You're going to get a whole lot of advantages here, and now like it's going to get better fuel economy, it's going to be a more consistent firing, it's just better all around. We didn't need to go with that before because like a diesel requires you to go with that, but when you go with that, it increases the cost of the engine. So to keep engines more affordable than that, we just went with sequential injection and throttle body and all that stuff beforehand. Anyways, you're going to maximize the airflow because now the airflow is free to go. You don't have fuel mixed in with the air, so what you're going to do is you're going to bring in more air because there's not fuel taking up that space. You're going to throw the fuel in right before the spark hits. So you're going to get more oxygen into the engine over shooting the fuel in, mixing it. Because remember, the fuel is going to take up space. We're going to remove that out of the equation and boof. Now you're going to get a noticeable percentage of more oxygen in there. So just by switching to direct injection on the same exact engine, you're going to pick up more power without anything else changed, just because of the added oxygen that's going to come in. You're also going to get more power because it's going to cool the chamber, so you can run higher compression. Kind of already talked about that a little bit. Power gains are going to increase. This is essential. This is really, really good with boost. You mix direct injection with boost, you're running some crazy numbers here. Very advanced. Like I said, basically what's going to happen here is right before your spark hits, it's going to put the fuel in there, preventing pre-detonation, cooling the chamber down. You're not going to have any fuel mixed in with the air intake, so you're going to get straight air. So you're going to get more of an air charge. Here's a more realistic diagram of what's going on. All right, so now we got the hybrid. The problem with the direct injection is you're going to have PCV, right? That's positive crankcase ventilator. That's going to suck the gases out of the crankcase. That helps prevent oil leaks. You need this. So when it sucks those crankcase gases out, it's going to go into the intake. Well, the problem is you're going to get oil built up on the intake valve. So all these power gains we're going to get, we're ultimately going to start losing them. Yeah, you can take the engine apart and clean the valves off or do some sort of fuel system cleaner constantly, but you know what? It gets finicky. It just doesn't have the reliability because that stuff gets gunked up on the intake valve and it screws everything up. Now we got hybrid. So what the hybrid does, it's a combination of both of them. It's going to have a valve injection as basically an irrigation. So it's just going to be spraying the valves, keeping the oil off. And you may be like, well, hey, doesn't that kind of mitigate the power and all the gains that you get from direct injection? And that's why it's a hybrid. Because at low idle speeds, it uses basically the irrigation injection to run the engine. But when you drop the hammer and you get in the throttle, those shut off or they don't increase, and then it switches to direct port injection. So it's going to save on those injectors because they're not running all the time, and you're going to get the clean valves. So it's just, this is where we're at currently right now. This is today's fuel injection as far as I know it. Maybe there's something out there I don't know about it, but this is what we're going at. This is where you're going to get the world's best performance currently today. This is what we're seeing. So this is your standard multi-port. Then you got GDI, direct injection into the cylinder. And now we got the hybrid. So again, this is going to irrigate off the valve. This is not going to control the high engine speeds. This is only for low torque applications. And then when you really get on it, now you're going to this. Takeaway, carburetor swaps, you know what? You do get power. They work. We have them pretty well figured out. But you do unlock more power by going with fuel injection. You're going to unlock more power potential. Again, this potential. You can still screw it up, but you're going to unlock more power potential. It's just better fuel economy. It's going to run better. However, there's more electronics involved with it. It's a more complicated system. Now you got to have an ECU. You have to decide what you're going to go with. Are you going to just go with a throttle body system? Are you going to go with a multi-port system? Are you going to go with direct injection? All that you got to figure out if you're going to go with that, and it raises the cost up. Now, if you go with like a Coyote, they already have this done. I think the new LT engines, the flat plane crank ones by Chevy, I think they're also direct injection. I don't know that. I got to look into that. The point is, carburetor works. It is cheap. It is lightweight. It is reliable. You want more power. You want to push past that. You got a big budget. Fuel injection is without a doubt the way to go. Anyways, appreciate you guys watching my videos. I hope you found it entertaining. If not, maybe just a little bit educational. If you'd like to help support the channel, click on that Amazon affiliate link. Even if you don't buy what that link is for, just clicking on it. Do the Amazon shopping you were already going to do anyway. And I'll kick back for it because you came there off my channel. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.